In early March 1945, in a forest clearing in southern Germany, the trees had been stripped bare by months of Allied bombing. Between them, pointed at the sky like a javelin, sat a wooden rocket on a steel rail. A man climbed in. His name was Lothar Sieber, a test pilot, 22 years old. In the next 90 seconds, he would become the first human being in history to launch vertically under rocket power. The cockpit was plywood. The fuselage was plywood. The instrument panel was minimal. A few gauges, a throttle, and a periscope. Because there was no windshield, Sieber could not see forward. His only view of the sky he was about to be shot into came through a narrow optical tube mounted above his head. Behind his seat, inches behind his spine, two fuel tanks sat side by side. One held T-Stoff, a concentrate of hydrogen peroxide so corrosive it dissolved human skin on contact. The other held C-Stoff, a cocktail of hydrazine hydrate and methanol. These two chemicals had one defining property. The moment they touched each other, they ignited. No spark required, no ignition system, just contact. They were separated from Sieber's back by a thin wall of aluminum. The countdown began. 4 solid fuel Schmidding boosters strapped to the tail roared to life. 3,750 pounds of thrust slammed into the base of the rocket. The rail shook, the trees bent, and Sieber went up. The acceleration was instantaneous. 8 Gs, then 10, the force of a freight train pressing him into the seat. At 500 feet the canopy tore away. Wind and exhaust flooded the cockpit. The periscope was useless. The controls were unresponsive. Sieber's vision narrowed, grayed, and within 10 seconds of launch, he was unconscious. The rocket pitched over. It arced across the gray sky trailing smoke, losing altitude, and struck the ground. The wreckage was splinters, wood and ash and silence. Sieber never reached his target. He never fired a single weapon. He became the first casualty of a machine designed to be thrown away after one use. Sieber was not an outlier. He was the logical conclusion of a pattern of desperation so extreme that entire nations abandoned reason and reached for the impossible. This is the story of 5 of those ideas. Weapons so bizarre they sound invented, but they were real. They were built. They were tested. And some of them almost worked. To understand why a man like Lothar Sieber climbed into that rocket, you have to understand the world that built it. That world was not insane. It was desperate. And desperation, as it turns out, is the most dangerous engineering fuel ever invented. By 1944, the war had entered a phase no military textbook had prepared for. The skies over Germany were no longer contested. They were occupied. 1,000 Allied bombers could cross into German airspace in a single afternoon, and the Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force on the planet, could barely get planes off the ground. Runways were craters. Fuel reserves were measured in days. Trained pilots were dead or captured. The conventional playbook was finished. That is when the unconventional playbook opened. The Germans had a word for what came next. Wunderwaffe. Wonder weapons. It sounds almost mythical, and that was the point. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's propaganda minister, didn't just approve these projects, he weaponized the idea of them. He told a starving, bombed-out population that a miracle was coming, that secret factories were building machines so powerful they would reverse the war overnight. The Wunderwaffe were not just military programs. They were manufactured, calculated, and ultimately hollow hope. And when you promise a nation a miracle, someone has to try to build one. This was not a German disease. It was a human one. Across the English Channel, the British had their own department of desperation. It was called the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, the DMWD. The men who ran it were known, without a trace of irony, as the Weasers and Dodgers. Their job was to invent things that no sane procurement officer would approve. And they did, with enthusiasm. Across the Atlantic, it was no different. The United States, the most industrially powerful nation on Earth, was funding projects that involved strapping explosives to bats and putting pigeons inside missiles. The President of the United States personally signed off on one of them. This was not fringe science. This was national policy. Even the Cold War could not kill the impulse. 2 decades after the last Wunderwaffe blueprints were burned, the CIA spent $20 million on a project called Acousticity. The plan was to surgically implant a microphone, a transmitter, and an antenna into a living cat. then send it to eavesdrop on Soviet diplomats in a park near the embassy. On its first mission, the cat was released from a surveillance van, walked into the street, and was immediately struck and killed by a taxi. $20 million. One dead cat. Zero intelligence gathered. The pattern is always the same. When the conventional answer fails, the human mind does not stop. It accelerates. It reaches past logic, past reason, past dignity, and grabs whatever is left. A pigeon, a bat, a plywood rocket, a cat with a wire in its skull. What follows are the results of that acceleration. 5 weapons that crossed the line from blueprint to prototype. 5 ideas that were physically constructed, physically tested, and then physically buried, sometimes literally. These are not fantasy sketches from the margins of an engineer's notebook. Every weapon on this list was built. Every weapon on this list was real. The first was a weapon so secret, so dangerous, that the government tested it on a public beach, in front of tourists. Number 5. The Great Panjandrum. 2 wooden wheels, each 10 feet tall, the height of a basketball hoop. Between them, a central drum packed with 2 tons of high explosives. Strapped to the rims of those wheels, 130 cordite rockets, all pointed in the same direction. The idea was straightforward. Light the rockets, the wheels spin, and the whole assembly rolls forward across the beach at 60 miles per hour, slams into the concrete wall of Hitler's Atlantic defenses, and detonates. 2 tons of explosive, delivered at speed, no soldiers required. A battering ram made of fire. The most powerful weapon on this list was essentially a giant firework on wheels. It was built by the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, the Weezers and Dodgers, under the supervision of Nevil Shute Norway. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Nevil Shute was one of the most celebrated novelists of the 20th century, the author of On the Beach and A Town Like Alice. Before that, he was an aeronautical engineer, and in 1943, his job was to make the Panjandrum work. He could not. The first trial took place in September of 1943 on a beach in Devon. The rockets ignited. The wheels spun. Within seconds, individual rockets began detaching from the rim. The device lost thrust on one side, curved violently, and circled back toward the launch crew. Men scattered across the sand. The Panjandrum rolled to a stop, smoking, lopsided, and completely useless. 3 weeks later, they tried again, this time with a third wheel, added for stability. It made no difference. The device launched, veered hard, and headed straight out to sea. They tried steel cables to control the steering. The cables snapped like thread under the force of 130 rockets. Then came the final test. In January 1944, senior military officials, the brass hats, lined the beach. The rockets fired. The Panjandrum launched forward, wobbled, shed rockets in every direction, and disintegrated in a spectacular cascade of fire and spinning wood. A terrier broke free from its owner and chased the burning wreckage across the sand. Generals dove headfirst into coils of barbed wire. The test was over. The project was dead. Nevil Shute Norway, the man who would go on to write some of the most important novels of his generation, erased the Panjandrum from his autobiography entirely, as if it had never happened. The trials had taken place on a public beach, in front of holidaymakers, under the protection of the Official Secrets Act, which threatened anyone who spoke about what they had seen. The greatest military comedy of the 20th century had played out in front of families on vacation, and no one was allowed to laugh. Number 4. Project Pigeon. In 1940, a psychologist named B.F. Skinner was watching a flock of birds from his office window. Skinner was not a military man. He was a behavioral scientist, arguably the most important one of his century. As he watched those birds bank and turn with perfect coordination, he had an idea that would consume the next 13 years of his life. What if you put a pigeon inside a bomb? The concept was called Project Pigeon, later renamed Orcon for Organic Control. The design called for a standard glide bomb, its crude mechanical guidance system removed, and replaced with 3 trained pigeons mounted inside the nose cone. In front of each pigeon, a translucent screen displayed a live image of the ground below, projected through a lens in the bomb's nose. The pigeons had been trained, through thousands of repetitions, to peck at the image of a specific target, a ship, a building, an airfield. Every peck activated a pneumatic valve. which adjusted the bomb's steering fins. 3 pigeons pecking in consensus meant the bomb corrected course in real time, constantly, relentlessly. 1 pigeon pecked 10,000 times in a single test without tiring and without hesitation. It worked. Under simulated combat conditions, noise, vibration, the acceleration of a terminal dive, the pigeons achieved 95% accuracy, at a time when the best electronic guidance systems in the world could not hit the right zip code. The project died not because of failure, but because of embarrassment. When Skinner demonstrated the system to the National Defense Research Committee, the room went quiet, not because the data was bad, but because the committee members could not reconcile the image of a living pigeon pecking inside a bomb with the seriousness of modern warfare. The spectacle of the bird undermined the science of the result. A black box of vacuum tubes felt like progress. A pigeon felt like a joke. The project was cancelled in 1944, resurrected by the Navy as Orcon in 48, and cancelled again permanently in 53, when electronic guidance finally became reliable enough to do what a pigeon had been doing for a decade. Skinner never forgave them. Number 3. The Bach-Emba 349 Natter. The Natter was a manned, vertically launched disposable interceptor. The aircraft was designed to be used once and destroyed. It had a wooden fuselage, a Walter W.Cake 109-509 rocket motor, and 24 Henschel Hs-217 rockets loaded into the nose like a shotgun shell the size of a telephone booth. Maximum speed, 620 miles per hour, faster than most Allied fighters. Total flight time, 2 to 6 minutes. It weighed about as much as a Volkswagen Beetle, moved at the speed of a modern fighter jet, and was made of the same material as a garden shed. The operational concept was brutal in its simplicity. Launch vertically, climb to bomber altitude, fire all 24 rockets into the formation, eject, parachute down. The plane crashes and is forgotten. Build another one tomorrow out of plywood and glue. The detail that defined the program's moral calculus was this: the SS, not the Luftwaffe, planned to staff the Natter program with Hitler Youth, teenagers. Because the aircraft required almost no piloting skill, the pilot did not need to take off, land, or navigate. He needed only to sit in a wooden box, survive the launch, point himself at the bombers, and pull a trigger. No training, no skill, just willingness. The Natter attempted to turn biology into a launch system. Germany was using human beings. Across the Atlantic, America had a stranger idea. They were going to use bats. Number 2. Project X-Ray, the Bat Bomb. It started with a dentist on vacation. In the winter of 1941, a Pennsylvania oral surgeon named Little S. Adams was visiting Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. At dusk, he stood at the mouth of the cave and watched as millions of Mexican free-tailed bats poured out of the darkness in a column so thick it blocked out the sky. The sound was a low, leathery roar, the beating of 20 million wings at once. Adams had one thought: what if each one of those bats was carrying a tiny bomb? Adams was not a crank. He was a well-connected inventor with friends in Washington. Weeks after Pearl Harbor, he wrote a letter directly to the White House. Not to a department, not to a committee, but to the president. Franklin Roosevelt read the letter, scribbled a note calling it an interesting idea, and forwarded it to the military for development. The President of the United States had approved the bat bomb. The bat in question was Tadarida brasiliensis, the Mexican free-tailed bat. Each one weighed about 12 grams, roughly the weight of a AA battery, but they were disproportionately strong. Each bat could carry a payload of 17 to 28 grams, more than twice its own body weight. They were also natural cavity seekers. In the wild, they roosted in crevices, under eaves, in the cracks of canyon walls. In an urban environment, they would instinctively crawl into attics, under roof tiles, beneath floorboards, deep into the wooden skeleton of a building. Japan in 1943 was a nation built largely of wood and paper. The architecture was a tinderbox. Adams wanted to set it on fire from the inside. The incendiary device was designed by Louis Fieser, the inventor of military-grade napalm. Fieser created what he called the H2 unit, a tiny cellulose capsule filled with napalm, weighing less than an ounce. It was clipped to the bat's chest with a surgical tie and fitted with a timed chemical fuse. Once ignited, the capsule burned for 8 minutes at temperatures high enough to melt steel. The delivery system was carefully engineered. Bats were cooled into a state of hibernation, their metabolisms slowed to almost nothing, and packed into a 5-foot cylindrical bomb casing. Each casing held 26 trays. Each tray held 40 bats. Total payload, 1,040 armed bats per bomb. The bomb would be dropped from a B-24 at altitude. A parachute would deploy, slowing the descent. At a preset altitude, the casing would crack open, the trays would separate, and over 1,000 bats would wake up in midair, each carrying a napalm charge. They would scatter across a radius of 20 to 40 miles and roost inside every wooden structure they could find. And then the fuses would ignite. Simultaneously, everywhere. The projected numbers were staggering. A single bomb load could start between 3,600 and 4,700 individual fires. Not one explosion, but thousands of small, silent, untraceable fires erupting from inside the walls of houses, temples, and factories, all at once. The military tested it. On a warm day in May of 1943, at Carlsbad Army Airfield, several armed bats escaped from their casing before the test was ready. They did exactly what they were designed to do. They sought shelter. They roosted under a fuel tank, inside a hangar, beneath the seats of a general's staff car. When the fuses ignited, Carlsbad Army Airfield burned to the ground. An accidental proof of concept. The bat bomb worked, by destroying the base that was testing it. An independent military review later concluded that in terms of weight-to-destruction ratio, the bat bomb was more efficient than the atomic bomb. More fires, more structural damage, fewer civilian casualties. But the Manhattan Project was ahead of schedule. Project X-ray was cancelled in 1944, not because it failed, but because something larger overtook it. Number 1. The Krumlauf. Every soldier in the history of warfare has had the same thought: what if my gun could shoot around corners? In 1943, German weapons engineers attempted to make that idea real. The result was the Krumlauf, literally, curved barrel. It was a bent steel tube that attached to the muzzle of the St. G-44, the world's first true assault rifle. The concept was that a soldier could stay behind a wall, slide the curved barrel around the edge, and fire without ever exposing himself to return fire. On paper, it was the ultimate infantry advantage. In practice, it was a physics lesson in humiliation. The Krumlauf came in 2 variants. The I version, for infantry, featured a 30-degree bend, enough to fire around a corner or over a trench lip. The P version, for panzer crews, went further, 45 degrees, and even 90 degrees in some prototypes. The Panzer variant was designed for tank crews to shoot down at infantry attempting to climb onto the hull, the lethal blind spot of every armored vehicle. When you force a bullet around a curve, several things go wrong in sequence. First, the gas pressure behind the round has nowhere to expand evenly. It builds up at the inner wall of the bend the way water slams against the outside of a river turn. The barrel bulges. The steel fatigues. After 150 rounds, 300 at best, the barrel splits open. A standard infantry rifle barrel lasts tens of thousands of rounds. The Krumlauf burned through its own body faster than a candle. Second, the bullet itself cannot survive the turn. The 7.92 mm round strikes the inside of the curve and fragments. What exits the other end is not a bullet, but a spray of jagged metal shards, a shotgun blast of shrapnel with no accuracy and no range. Effective distance drops from 300 meters to roughly 100. The precision of the St. G-44 is erased. Third, the weight. The attachment alone added 3 pounds. On top of the St. G-44's 11 pounds, the combined weapon weighed over 14 pounds, heavier than a light machine gun, with the effective accuracy of a sidearm. The sighting system was a 1.5 times magnification periscope, with a 12-degree field of vision, the equivalent of aiming a rifle while looking through a keyhole. And yet, the Krumlauf saw combat, not because it worked as designed, but because its failure created something unexpected. Soldiers would shove the barrel around a doorframe and fire blind. The fragmented rounds ricocheted off walls, ceilings, and floors in unpredictable patterns. Enemy soldiers on the receiving end reported the overwhelming sensation of being shot at from impossible angles, as if gunfire was coming from inside the walls themselves. A weapon built for precision became a weapon of psychological terror, a mechanical failure repurposed as a fear machine. 60 years later, the Israelis built the corner shot, A hinged pistol platform with a mounted camera that lets the shooter see and fire around corners without exposure. It works. It does not use a curved barrel, because some problems are not solved by bending reality. They are solved by waiting for reality to catch up. 5 weapons. 5 ideas that should have been impossible. Every single one was built. The conventional reading of this list treats these as products of madness. Lunatic inventors scribbling on napkins, military committees too drunk on their own budgets to say no. That is the easy interpretation, and it is wrong. None of these weapons failed because they did not work. The pigeons could steer a missile with 95% accuracy, better than any electronic system of the era. The bats could burn a city. They proved it by accident when they incinerated their own test facility. The panjandrum had enough explosive force to breach the Atlantic Wall. The Natter could reach bomber altitude faster than any interceptor in the Allied arsenal. And the Krumlov could in fact send a bullet around a corner. They all worked. On paper, in testing, in brief and terrifying flashes of proof. And then, they all died. Not because the science was wrong, but because they violated something deeper and quieter, the psychological comfort zone of the people writing the checks. The Pentagon could accept a billion-dollar electronic guidance computer housed in a steel box. It could not accept a pigeon. The British Admiralty could approve 1,000 conventional bombs. It could not approve a giant wheel covered in fireworks. The technology worked. The aesthetics did not. That observation reveals something uncomfortable about how progress actually happens. It is not enough to build something that functions. You have to build something that the people in power can look at without flinching. Viewed through a different lens, not as failures but as categories, a pattern emerges. The Natter and the Krumlov were defeated by materials. 1944 plywood could not survive a vertical rocket launch. 1944 steel could not bend a bullet without destroying itself. The blueprints were ahead of the molecules. The ideas were sound. The atoms were not. The panjandrum was defeated by control. It had more than enough energy. 130 rockets and 2 tons of explosives could breach anything. But energy without direction is not a weapon. It is a spectacle. The panjandrum did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was wild. The biological weapons, Project Pigeon and Project X-ray, were the earliest attempts at autonomous systems. Skinner's pigeons processed visual data in real time, made targeting decisions, and adjusted a flight path without electronics, without software, without a single line of code. They were biological processors, living guidance computers made of feathers and instinct. The bats were autonomous delivery vehicles, self-navigating, self-dispersing, target-seeking incendiaries that required no human operator after deployment. Drop them and walk away. They found the targets themselves. Stripped of the feathers and the fur, these are the philosophical ancestors of every modern drone, every autonomous munition, every fire-and-forget missile in every arsenal on Earth. The idea was right. The substrate was wrong. We needed silicon. They had pigeons. The impulse never died. 20 years after Skinner's pigeons were grounded, the CIA spent $20 million trying to turn a house cat into a surveillance device. Acousticity, a living microphone with a tail, surgically wired with a transmitter and an antenna, released from a van on its first mission outside the Soviet embassy, and killed instantly by a passing taxi. The most expensive roadkill in the history of American intelligence. The urge to weaponize biology persisted long after anyone should have known better. There is one more weapon that belongs on this list. The wind cannoni, the wind cannon. It used the explosive combustion of hydrogen and oxygen to fire a concentrated slug of compressed air. In testing at Hillersleben, it snapped a 25-millimeter wooden board clean in half at 200 meters. Pure air, moving fast enough to destroy solid wood. It was deployed once, at a bridge over the Elbe River in the final weeks of the war, against Allied aircraft. It did nothing. The last gasp of the Wunderwaffe was a cannon that shot wind at airplanes. One man deserves to be returned to. Lothar Sieber, the pilot from the beginning, the man who climbed into a plywood rocket with no forward visibility, powered by chemicals that would combust the instant they touched, aimed with a periscope, and launched at 8 Gs into the sky over a country that had already lost its war. He was not bizarre, he was brave. That distinction between the weapon and the person inside it is the real lesson of this list. Every weapon described here was called impossible. Every single one was built anyway. That gap between impossible and built is where all of human progress lives. The space where engineers argue with physics and sometimes win. Sometimes the gap is where genius is born, and sometimes it is where genius goes to die.